Welcome back to the Information Security Forum podcast. As ever, I'm here with Steve Durbin, Managing Director, and we're here today to talk about cyber and the board. Stop making excuses and start making the decisions that matter. When we talk about engagement between the board and cybersecurity, we've moved away from the board doesn't get it, to the board gets it, to the board doesn't feel they are sufficiently briefed when a breach takes place. But Steve, is all this evasive talk from the board to avoid responsibility? Surely by now, after seeing and in some cases experiencing the impact of a breach and the potential financial penalties from upcoming GDPR legislation, the board should have cybersecurity built into its business strategy. So why is the board failing to accept the importance of cybersecurity and resilience as a strategic business issue and spend the resources needed to respond to that?
I don't know that boards aren't considering it as being a strategic business issue. I mean, I think that there have been, recently anyway, quite a bit of research done in this space that shows the opposite, that smart boards do get it. Smart boards do understand that cybersecurity is a bit of a differentiator when it comes to the way in which they can go to market, the way in which they can continually increase the level of trust that their customer base has in them as an entity. I think the challenge is different. I think that the challenge for boards is, okay, we get it, so now what do we do? That's the real issue for me. They often don't know. And from an information security and a cybersecurity and a risk management perspective, I think the onus really is on those professionals to really articulate better what it is that a board should be doing, to provide that within the context of the business, to provide it within the context of the things that a board is used to seeing. And that for me is really the big challenge. I think that the number of recent breaches that we've seen, I'm thinking of people like Equifax in the UK, I'm thinking about NHS, I'm thinking about Deloitte. These have really hit the headlines. And I think boards get it. We've also got, of course, upcoming legislation, which they understand. I'm thinking here in particular of the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, which comes about in May next year, 2018. So I think that there is always the risk of us being a little bit too simplistic in this and saying, well, boards don't really understand. And that's, I suppose, quite natural. It's quite human, isn't it? I'm very often misunderstood. But actually, I think there is a real onus on the security profession to get it together, to be able to position security as a business issue, because that is actually what it is. There is no business today that is able to function outside of cyberspace. And that really is the reality, I think, that very many boards have come to accept. They just don't know what to do about it.
So there's no silver bullet. What are the specific actions that the board and business leaders can take today to embed cybersecurity into their business strategy? If no one can operate outside of the internet, what do we do?
I think you have to go back to basic principles. I think you have to understand from an organizational standpoint your reliance on cyber. So how is it important to you? How does it contribute to the way in which you go to market? How does it contribute to the way in which you gain customers, the way in which you optimize research and development, the way in which you are able to bring new product to market in a much more speedy and ready fashion? So you have to look at it from that perspective, from the traditional elements, if you like. And then you have to try to break out what the impact would be of loss of information across all of those different areas. You then have to work collaboratively across the business to determine just how important those things are. In a lot of instances, of course, a breach that doesn't impact your core business or doesn't impact your core critical asset, whilst inconvenient, is not going to bring your business to a grinding halt. There are other elements that will. And so I think in the early stages, you have to focus on that first. So it's about really getting a better understanding of your dependence on cyber, a better understanding of what would happen if you did lose information or if you did lose connectivity, if we're thinking about things like the internet, for instance, and then positioning that within the relatively traditional realm of risk management. If you can do that, then actually your organization begins to raise its understanding, its awareness that cyber is probably not very different from anything else that's come along in the history of the organization. The challenge that we face, of course, is that we continue to view cyber as something that is very, very different. And it is, but it isn't if you break it down, because it's just another development along the way in terms of an organizational life.
You just said when there's a breach of something that's not critical, it doesn't decimate your business or your product. Do you think that boards are in the habit of ignoring smaller, lesser impactful breaches?
Well, it's going to be very interesting when the General Data Protection Regulation comes about, for instance, because what I anticipate that doing is raising the level of awareness of breaches that relate to personally identifiable information of EU citizens. Now, what we'll have to figure out is whether or not that is an increase in the amount of breaches that have taken place or simply an increase in the reporting of some of those breaches. And that, for me, is really going to be probably the most interesting piece of information with regard to the number of breaches that take place and the reporting of them. I think there's another interesting thing in that as well, in that GDPR, for those organizations that are implementing it correctly, is nothing to do with compliance. It's not a tick box. It's about culture change. And I hear quite often, particularly IT guys, talking about GDPR as if it is something that's more akin to Y2K. So, at a certain date at a point in the future, systems will come to a grinding halt. So with GDPR, it will suddenly come in and we're expecting all of these breaches to take place. For me, that misses the point. And really, it is hugely pertinent to what we've just been talking about within the context of the board. Because GDPR has nothing at all to do with a single point in time. GDPR is about culture change. It's about how you morph your organization to be more responsible with the way that you handle personal information. It isn't something that happens on one day in a 12-month period and then we all breathe a sigh of relief. If you come at it from an IT or a compliance standpoint, you will miss the point. And the point about GDPR is it's culture change. The point about GDPR is that it's all about how you train and rework your business processes. And the real danger with it is that you can have a breach at any time. So you have to make sure that your GDPR process is something that is working 24/7 every single day for the rest of your organizational life. That is the real challenge of GDPR. And do boards get that? Some of them do. Some of the smarter ones have viewed it as a huge opportunity rather than a compliance requirement. Others, I think, are still laboring under this misapprehension that it is, an IT issue. It is a legal issue. And it isn't. It's a corporate-wide issue. So again, if we look at the role of the board in all of this, what are they there to do? Well, they have to ask the right questions. They have to ask about the implications of some of these things. Is it something that is a single shot that will happen on a single day? Or is it something that has much bigger ramification? And I think there's been too much focus on things like the fines that can be levied. There's been too much focus on things like the right to be forgotten. The real focus needs to be on the way in which you need to transform your business from the board right the way down. So for me, that is a good example of how boards need to get better engaged. There is a direct line of linkage between getting your business in shape from a cybersecurity standpoint and the bottom line in terms of customer attraction, in terms of your ability to be more effective in the marketplace. Increasingly, in terms of the way in which your customer base will trust you as an organization. And that's going to become increasingly important, this whole trust paradigm. That's another good area where boards should be paying very much more attention. But do they know to ask these questions? That's the real issue.
I think 130 some million Americans who were affected by the Equifax breach would agree that trust is pretty important. How will the board have to adapt to the cybersecurity workforce of the future then? If this is a human issue, what is the business model with the human culture that gets this really at the core? What is that going to look like?
I think that is probably one of the toughest areas for organizations, because within an organizational construct, you have different individuals at different stages of development from a career standpoint, for instance. If you look at your overall workforce, you'll have a number who are perhaps in the sub 30 years block. You'll have some who are in the 30 to 50 and some who are above that. If you just take those three blocks, and I'm being very simplistic here, but if you just take those three blocks and you look at the way in which technology is used, it is very different. There are less concerns about privacy, for instance, in the younger block than there is perhaps in some of the older blocks. So from an organizational point of view, when you have to look at how you can raise awareness of cybersecurity, you can't do it in a one-size-fits-all fashion. You have to be effective, relate to the individuals. You have to be presenting them with a means of working that, yes, raises the level of security from an organizational standpoint, but takes into account their personal requirements, the way in which they use technology. You can't do that unless you really get inside the head of the individual, really understand how they use the technology, why they do the things that they do. And so we move much more, I think, into the whole psychology of human-machine interface, human security interface. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that particular area, I think, for us to really understand how we can bring about long-lasting change in some of these areas, given all of the different variables that most organizations will have. But one thing is for certain, if we continue to work on awareness in the way that we've traditionally done in the past, so I'm thinking about things like caps and mugs and T-shirts and goodness knows what else, we certainly won't make the progress that's necessary. We have to get much smarter about it, and we have to do a lot more work in terms of understanding how we as individuals interact with that security interface and, as I say, the machine interface.
I like what you're saying, that it's not anything new. It seems like it's new, but cybersecurity is a human cultural issue. Businesses have dealt with challenges that need to be addressed through a human response, a cultural shift. So that is demystifying something that may seem out of the realm for many businesses. So I think that's a powerful message you're offering. This is an interesting conversation, as always. And while some board members may find some of your insights challenging, there's no getting away from the fact that cybersecurity is constantly evolving and moving forward, and so the board is going to have to keep pace through all of those shifts. It's evident that the board needs to step up to the plate and move cybersecurity from a discretionary to a business spend, and leverage the expertise of their security teams to support their business strategy goals. To find out how better to build engagement between the board and the security teams, and through engagement build a stronger cyber resilience capability, please see the range of executive summaries at securityforum.org. Thank you so much, Steve.